Welcome to another installment of the United States Veterans History Project. Today we are at 2762 Georgetown Boulevard in Ann Arbor, Michigan, speaking with Mrs. Virginia Hunt. Mrs. Hunt is the widow of World War II veteran George S. Hunt, who served in the United States Army Air Corps, attaining the rank of First Lieutenant. Mr. Hunt served in the European theater as a B-17 co-pilot. His plane was shot down on its 13th mission. Held at Stalag Luft 1, he was freed by the Russians in 1945. Mrs. Hunt will be sharing her memories of her husband and the time they shared during the Second World War, with additional experiences during their time together before and after the war. She has many mementos of their time together, some of which we will be seeing. My name is Rick Caton. I will be conducting today's interview. Let's now meet Mrs. Hunt. We're meeting Mrs. Virginia Hunt. Mrs. Hunt has a letter to read onto our record from
Luther Smith,
who was
Walter Gunner, on the B-17 that was shot down over Germany. We've kept in touch over the years, and when I had to give a talk to my granddaughter Catherine's class in the year 2000, I asked him to write to me and give me some insight as to how the bomber crew behaved or operated, or how he felt about it now that the war was done. And so he said, "Ginny, I will try to get some words down on my screen to see what I can send you that you might be able to use in your talk to Catherine's classmates. Feel free to edit them. First, as I said on the phone, I always wanted to fly, and the opportunity came when America entered World War II. Plane crews were needed desperately, for we were not prepared for war. A rush program was implemented, training pilots and other crew members. I enlisted in October 1942, and after attending gunnery school and armament school, was assigned to a B-17 crew at Pyote, Texas, where I met your husband and the other crew members. This was in July 1943. After training and being sent to a bomber base in England, we flew missions until being shot down and becoming prisoners of war in Germany. We all came home, and I have been fortunate in having a crew that kept in touch over the years. This has led to a friendship with what I call my extended family, namely you and your son George and his wife Diana and his daughter Catherine. This friendship means a great deal to me, keeps alive the bond that is an integral part of a crew. A bond that is hard to describe, but similar to that of a team member in sports, only stronger. Through this relationship has come contact with those that are left of my crew, the pilot and the tail gunner. Your son George found my tail gunner for me through a search service which advertised on the net. This summer we're going to meet at an air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. This will be the first time that I have seen the tail gunner in 54 years. The war was something that we all wished had never happened. I look back on it and remember the strong feeling of patriotism that prevailed. Everyone working at his job, contributing vital and needed effort towards victory. As a result of my service experience, I became acquainted with 9 great guys on my crew whom I loved like brothers. This was a very helpful note to me because as I talked to the class members in Catherine's room, I was also aware that these young children sitting there in their seats had no idea of what a prisoner of war life would be like. And I did tell them a few of the stories that my husband had told me. I want to tell you the story of the Spirit of Winsome Win II. This is a B-17 Flying Fortress, number 42 37793. The story begins during the early hours of the morning of Tuesday, 8th February, 1944. At Grafton Underwood, a United States Air Force base in North Hampshire, this airfield was home to the 305th Bomb Group and the 384th Bomb Group, both part of the 1st Bomb Division, 8th United States Air Force B-17's Flying Fortresses. My husband was a part of that team. The crews were briefed, and very soon the Bomb Group Division had dispatched 120 aircraft who were quickly airborne, the target being the marshalling yards at Frankfurt. The time was then 0500 hours. One of the B-17s that took off that dark morning was one named the Spirit of Winsome Wind 2, number 4237793 SO-X. This aircraft was flown by 2nd Lieutenant Norman DeFries. There were 9 other crew members. They had already been involved in drama when on the 9th January, little more than a month earlier, and in a different B-17, they crash-landed at Little Staunton due to an undercarriage failure. The aircraft was a write-off, but luckily there were no injuries to the crew, although they were pretty well shaken up, as you would expect. On another flight, a practice mission with another crew's aircraft again, there was a problem with the landing gear, and this time Norman and George bellied the aircraft in, perfect, and no one was hurt. Norman DeFries, taking up the story, says that it was a rare and beautiful day over southwestern Europe and very clear. We had assembled after takeoff at 28,000 feet, having a very strong westerly wind, and arrived without incident. This flight took about 2 hours. We were over the target and released our bombs. I remember that it was so clear that you could actually see the snow on the ground and the muzzle flash of the anti-aircraft 88s on the ground. It was at this point, just after bombs away, that a huge blast of black flak appeared above the nose, a short distance ahead of the aircraft. I noted the oil pressure start to fall on the left outboard engine, and I then quickly hit the feather button. Seconds later, I noticed the same thing occurring to the right outboard and got it feathered. Our nose dropped, and despite full throttle and 48 inches of manifold pressure on the 2 inboard engines, we were losing height at 150 feet per minute and only flying at 95 miles per hour. I called for the navigator, Ivan Moody, and was told that he would be along shortly. I told him the problems that we had. He plotted a great course, and we evaded any further flak.
I called the radio room and told Wright, the radio operator, to get Smitty, Luther Smith, the ball turret gunner, out of there and to see if between them they could drop the ball turret in order to lessen the weight of the plane. At this point, about the French border, we were down from 28,000 to 8,000 feet. I felt the ball turret go, and the plane's speed immediately leapt from 95 miles per hour to 110, and I decided to then let the aircraft down to 1,500 feet. This then giving relief to the 2 inboard engines, which had by then been operating at full takeoff power for more than 3.5 hours. This was quite remarkable, as they should only operate at full power for about 5 minutes. We kept on course for England, and it wasn't long before the Channel was in sight. I knew that we were still not out of trouble, telling the crew to prepare for ditching. I then called Air Sea Rescue. We met 2 Spitfires at mid-channel, and one of them did a vertical bank directly in front of our plane, which meant, follow me. We cleared the channel, coming in over England at about 500 feet above the terrain. I then thought I saw an airfield. I lowered the landing gear and put the plane into a bank, preparing to land. Just then, red flares shot up from the field, and I saw tanks beginning to move around on what I had taken to be an airfield. The Spitfire again signaled to me to follow, and we then headed across to Brighton. While we were flying over the town, the right inboard motor ran out of gas. Now we had a bit more of a problem, and I needed to get down as soon as possible. From my perspective, there appeared to be less habitation to my right, As I put the nose down, the navigator said, "Get over the wires." I said, "Crash landing, Ivan." The navigator came running up from the nose to the radio room, and was then my first realization that he had been hit. He was injured by flak while over the target in Germany. His head was swathed in gauze. As I looked down at the terrain, I saw the 120,000-volt power lines and a ditch of some 20 to 30 yards in width, a plowed hillside ascending directly away from the ditch. The right wing of our plane was heading for the metal tower supporting the power lines, and at the same time I realized I was so close to the ground that if I attempted to bank, my left wing tip would go into the ground. I yelled at George Hunt, my co-pilot, "Follow me through." There was no time left for dithering. We both turned right aileron into the tower and both stepped full on the left rudder. The plane did a nice flat crab to the left. The plane hit on the landing gear on this side of the ditch and ballooned across the ditch under the wires and ballooned again up the plowed hillside. We then just pulled the stick back and plopped into the muck. Our speed on landing was about 70 miles per hour, and the time was somewhere between 12 noon and 1 p.m. Can't remember exactly. I know that if our landing gear had not been down, we would have gone nose down first into that ditch.
One of the crew members, Luther Smitty, was the aircraft's ball turret gunner, and he takes up the story. February 8, 1944, the target was Frankfurt. We had a very strong west wind that day, and in a very short time we were over the target. Flak knocked out 2 of our engines while we were still over the target. I'm not sure which ones were hit, but I think they were the inboard ones, numbers 2 and 3. At the same time, our navigator, Ivan Moody from Kansas, was hit. A piece of flak went through his steel infantry helmet that he was wearing on top of his leather flying helmet. The flak creased the top of his head. The bombardier, Ellis Miller from Illinois, put a bandage on Moody, and then he went back to work on his blood-stained charts. Flying on only 2 engines, we could not stay with the rest of the formation, and the wind that had helped us to make a quick trip to the target was now something we could have done without. At one time, Moody estimated that our ground speed was only 60 miles per hour. We dumped the ball turret somewhere over France, and until then we were losing altitude so badly that we would not have made it even to the channel. The turret weighed 1,290 pounds. Then the weight of the ammunition, and by getting rid of it, jumped our airspeed up by something like 20 miles per hour, and this in turn slowed our descent. As far as I can tell, we were the first crew to jetson the ball turret, actually on a mission. Throughout the remainder of the war, several crews dropped their ball turrets. The only thing we should have done was to have kept our ball turret gun sight, as apparently they were in short supply. Crossing the channel, we prepared for ditching in the sea. None of us thought that our fuel supply would last. Spitfires met us over the channel, and we were escorted back to a grass fighter field near Brighton, Shoreham. When on approach with our wheels down, the 3rd engine quit. Our pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Norman DeFries, saw a patch of plowed ground and made towards it. The navigator, Ivan Moody, suddenly saw wires. In the split seconds it was left to make a decision. DeFries knew that he couldn't get over the wires with just power from one engine, so he decided to make a crash landing under them. These cables were carrying 120,000 volts. It was a very good job of flying, and we were also proud of the 2 men in the pilot seats. With the 2 emergency type landings which our pilot Norman had made, there was complete faith in our pilots, knowing what they should do everything possible to bring us home safely. After all, it was their butts as well as ours. Even so, the welfare of the crew was uppermost in their minds. Just a word about the cold at that high altitude. It certainly was very cold. Everyone wore electrically heated suits, with the waist gunners also wearing fleeced line suits. Incidentally, not only had our pilot proved his immaculate skill, but when we were on the approach to the field with the wheels down, it was at this point that the 3rd engine quit. Then not only did Norman have to set the plane down immediately, going down under the high tension cables, but he also had to side slip to avoid hitting a tower where the cables were affixed with the wingtip. Norman DeFries again takes up the story.
We all exited the aircraft and gathered around one of the crew, who had sprained his ankle on jumping to the ground from the radio room hatch, which is quite high when the aircraft is standing on its landing gear. I was later told that my co-pilot, George Hunt, may have said a prayer. The gathering around the airman who sprained his ankle may have been mistaken for group prayer. I believe that a postman was the first on the scene, and then, not long after the landing, the local police from Brighton arrived. We were flown back to our base on a B-17 out of Shoreham on the 10th of February. Luther Smith, Smitty, now continues his story. After we were down a while, a gentleman climbed the hill to where we were with a huge picnic basket filled with sandwiches, 2 large thermos bottles of tea, and a bottle of cognac. I will never forget his greeting. "I say, Yanks, that was a jolly good landing." It was nice of him to have done this for us, as I do believe that the tea laced with cognac was the best I ever tasted. While Winsome Wind 2 was crossing France on the way back, and before the ball turret was dropped, another fortress behind us was having trouble. This aircraft was shot down by 2 Me-109s. There was no return fire from the fortress, and it was soon going down. The German planes soon disappeared. The pilot asked for some fighter support due to the aircraft having engine trouble, and 4 P-47s dropped back from escorting a number of bombers that were ahead of Winsome Wind 2. They stayed until they had fuel problems. The gentleman who took the picnic basket to the crew soon after they landed was almost certainly Mr. Robert Swan, who together with his wife Maud owned and ran the boarding kennels Belmont. They are now the RSPCA kennels. He actually was the first person to reach the plane. Mrs. Connie King, the daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Swan, also visited the scene of the crash, but this was after the crew had left the scene and returned to their base. Following the crash landing, members of the RAF regiment based at Shoreham arrived to guard the aircraft. A day or so after, a team of engineers from the 8th Air Force Base arrived to carry out the repairs. This took several days. When the repair work was completed, the people living in the Churchill area were temporarily evacuated from their homes as a precaution. The Flying Fortress opened up each engine in turn, crewed by the minimum persons, turned around to face southwards, and with a great roar, took off and was flown back to its base at Grafton, Underwood.
On the return to their base, the Winsome Wind 2 crew was assigned to a brand new B-17G Fortress, still in its bright silver paint, with no camouflaging. The crew in this brand new aircraft took off on the morning of the 22nd of February 1944, just 14 days after their crash landing incident at Patcham, Brighton. This mission on this day was to bomb Ascherleben, Germany. This B-17 had no name, but its registration number was SN4297488SO 544 Squadron. Second Lieutenant Norman DeFries, the pilot, stated on 22nd of February 1944, he had the same crew and together with a large number of other planes were given the target of Ascherleben, Germany, taking off at 4 a.m. He writes, England had clouds up to 28,000 feet. Assembly was a mess. Our group ran through another group at right angles, and by the time it was over, each group had lost 1 plane and crew. The fighter escort could not get off. The German fighters met us at mid-channel, and our plane was deputy lead, high squadron on the right. The formation was a new, unworkable concept. We'd always flown wings in trail. On this day it was supposed to be wings abreast. Somehow overlooked the fact that if the lead flew at an airspeed of 150 miles per hour, the airplanes on the outside of the turn would have to fly 225 miles per hour to 250 miles per hour to maintain formation. This was the one and only time it was attempted. After an hour of Me-109 fighter attacks during which we would take small Jinx evasive action, as the tail gunner would relate the direction of incoming fighter attacks, I went to dump the nose a slight amount, and the plane went into a vertical dive of 9,000 feet. The co-pilot and I finally got the plane under control. We had released our bombs and turned toward England. We planned to make gradual let down to the deck, but needless to say, our faith in the stability of our aircraft was badly shaken. I asked the tail gunner what had happened to our plane, and he replied that most of the horizontal empennage was shot away. The right inboard motor was shot out, windmilling and causing vibration. He then shouted, "Look over your shoulder." I saw 12 to 15 Me-109s coming up beneath us, and I gave the order to bail out. We were at 13,000 feet. I got up and looked down into the nose. The navigator and bombardier were out. I went back through the bomb bay. The doors were open. All the crewmen had bailed out. At this time, I am walking around with my leg straps to my backpack parachute dangling around 5,000 feet, and then pulled the D-ring. I felt the shock of my weight against my underarms and was thankfully able to hold on until touchdown. The only ill effects from my stupidity were 2 huge bruises under each armpit. A village constable took me in tow to a crossroad where the rest of the crew, except Ivan Moody, the navigator, who had already been taken to hospital with serious wounds. Smitty was laying on the ground with his right hand and his arm halfway to his elbow severed. He asked for a cigarette, and I lit one for him and stuck it in his mouth. The co-pilot, George Hunt, Bombardier Ellis Miller, and myself went to Stalag Luft 1 at Barth, Germany, and were returned to the USA in May of 1945.
Whilst over Germany, the aircraft was attacked by fighters and shot down. During the attack, Luther Smith, Smitty, the ball turret gunner, suffered very serious injuries to his right arm. The order was given to bail out, and at this stage the crew knew that if they survived, then they were almost certainly to become POWs. Due to the injuries to his arm, Luther Smith was unable to don his parachute. Another member of the crew, realizing his predicament, quickly strapped on a spare parachute and with little time left, affixed it to the static line and quickly pushed him out. The crew all landed safely, were captured, and became prisoners of war. Meanwhile, the aircraft crashed near Wesel, Germany, bursting into flames. Luther Smith was taken to hospital, where he had his arm amputated. He spent some time in hospital, and about 8 months after being shot down through the Red Cross, he was released and returned to the USA. On the 11th of March, 1944, the Spirit of Winsome Wind 2, after being fully repaired, was returned to the 384th Bomb Group and was taken over by a new crew. This crew had recently completed their training and had just flown in from the USA. Just a week later, on the 18th of March, the aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Roger E. Smith, took off on a bombing mission to Oberpfaffenhofen, Germany. The aircraft was shot down, crash landing in Switzerland, where the crew were interned. The damaged aircraft was eventually dismantled and taken by train to Dabendorf. Trevor Evans stated that during the afternoon of Tuesday, 8th February 1944, he was a young lad and was standing in the playground of his school at Pacham. A huge American bomber flew very low over the school and made a forced landing on the downs behind Court Farm. I ran from my school all the way up to the farm, and when I got there I was given a lift by a friendly Land Army girl on her tractor. We went up to the grounded aircraft. On arrival I was amazed to see the crew, some sitting and some laying on the grass, near to their downed aircraft.
As Luther writes, or Smitty as he liked to be called, on the second mission, the one where we got shot down, my POW camp was Luft 4. The enlisted men were sent to one camp and the officers were sent to another. Luft 4 was situated south of the Baltic near Poland. He was there several months in convalescent hospitals after the operation to amputate my hand. Two of the hospitals were Obermarsfeld and Meiningen. These were run by English doctors. In late July or early August, 6 of us who were deemed unfit for military service left Luftwaffe and went to Annaberg, Germany, where we boarded a Red Cross train which took all of those who were being exchanged to Sweden. Finally, it is somewhat amazing that the interest in our landing at Patcham all those years ago is still alive. It is fully appreciated the interest shown by the British people in the 8th Air Force and their dedication in keeping the history and memories alive. It is still even more interesting to me as the widow of First Lieutenant George S. Hunt that our country is documenting the terrible war activities and how it all happened. And one ordinary man survived it and came home to create a family. When George came back from the war, one of the things that I like to tell was how momentous it was to open the hotel door and see this man in uniform that I hadn't seen for 21 months and be hugged for a long, long time by my husband. Because this war did things to me that I really haven't talked about very much. But when he was missing in action, and I didn't hear from him, and no word, even though I read Ernie Pyle's articles in the paper every day to see how the war was going and where the Russians were to finish wiping up the Germans to end the war, I was so glad to see George, but I almost felt I had a nervous breakdown waiting to find out whether he would come home or not. But I didn't, and I continued to teach school, and then he began, in the time that we were together, to tell me stories about prisoner life. One of the things that I remember most about George's imprisonment was that the food was dreadful. He had bugs in his breakfast cereal, and he said, I would just sit there and say, it's protein, eat it, because I knew there would be no more. He hid chocolate on his body so that the other prisoners in the room would not find it and eat it. He learned that anything that he wanted to keep had to be very carefully hidden or it would be taken by somebody who was very hungry. They did not have many baths, and when they did, they were cold. They did not have many haircuts, and when they were released, they were all asked to get out of their clothes, and they were deloused. Their heads were shaven, their bodies were shaven, and the bugs were gotten rid of. When he came home, the thing that I remember the most, we were sitting at a dinner, and many dinners were given for him to show him how glad we were for his safety. He sat at the dinner table eating angel food cake and crying. I was just astonished. And he said, it's the most wonderful food I've ever eaten. He was to become a diabetic later, and he would tell us when we had sweets in the house, please put one in the freezer and don't anybody eat that. When I have a reaction or low blood sugar and need something to eat, I will go get it and eat it. So the children and I learned to save a donut or a slice of pie or a special ice cream bar for George because we knew that it would be very, very special to him. I want to relate to you that George, after a while, rarely talked about prison camp. He mostly was interested in getting a good education, and so we came to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we lived in a little cabin on Geddes Avenue, and we learned to live very simply and he got a stipend from the government of $99 a month, and he went to college. He studied natural resources, and eventually he got his undergraduate degree, his master's, and his PhD, and he was invited to stay, and he became a professor of natural resources. Now I'm very pleased to tell you that one of my granddaughters, Carolyn Dawn Hunt, is an interpreter in one of the national parks out in Colorado. And she happened to find her grandfather's naturalist interpreter's certificate. And so she says, I'm following in Grandpa's footsteps. I really believe she is, because she cares about the land and the trees and the people. And she wants to help make this a better country. Do you have any more questions for me?
Okay, Mrs. Hunt, we are looking at a very nice map that you were able to obtain that diagrams some of the places where prisoners were held within the Third Reich. I think it would be interesting to our viewers if you could point out where Stalag Luft 1 was located.
It was right here on the Baltic Sea, and it was very cold, and only the officers were housed here, and the conditions were very poor. It leads me to tell you that one of the stories that George brought back, and Mr. DeFries, Norman DeFries, told me, was one day our Red Cross packages arrived in a batch of 10,000, and the German in charge, wanted to just put them out on a table and allow the men to come and pick one up. And the American general said, no, you do not do it that way. You line the men up, and we allow them to go one by one to pick up one package, and only one. Otherwise there will be a battle to obtain 2 or 3 at a time. When I sent a package, I would send a carton of cigarettes, which I'm sorry I did, but George smoked, and he could use them as money to get chocolate or another clean rag, or not be cruelly treated, whatever. But he also, I sent cake mix, cookies, medicine, bandages, and one time Mother and I put together a Red Cross package with only little packets of cinnamon and cumin and salt and pepper and the things that make food taste good. And later on I found out that that was really, really appreciated. But that story that I just told you about 10,000 packages arriving at once and the man wanting them to get them all at once. No. There had to be some order so that every man would get his own single package. I was allowed to send them 4 times a year.
Okay, Mrs. Hunt, let's go back now to the time when George returned from being a prisoner of war. Can you tell us a little bit about your first meeting when you saw him back in the United States?
George called me from Boston, where the ship landed, or the plane landed, and he said, I want you to go to Indianapolis, Indiana on the train, and I have reserved a room for you in the hotel. I want us to stay there 2 days without family, because I want to be with you and only with you for 2 days. Well, one of the most happy times of my life was to open that door of the hotel and to see my husband standing there in his uniform, and to hug him and to tell him, I'm just so grateful you're home and alive and you're well, but you're awfully skinny. Yes, I am very skinny. And so we spent 2 days talking about what he wanted to do and what his life had been like in the prison camp and what my life had been like. And he was very worried that maybe I'd found somebody else, but I hadn't written him a Dear John letter. But that had never entered my mind because he was my husband. And a few months later, as our relationship began again, I was amazed to have him say, I want us to have a child very soon because I'm worried about whether all those deprivations I suffered would cause me not to be able to have a child. Well, after we went to Ann Arbor, Michigan for him to study, we had George Jr. And fortunately, we waited until he had his first job as a natural resource person in the state of Michigan for about 3 years to have another child. And then when he came back and became a professor at the invitation of Warren Chase, we had Marilee Margaret Hunt. And that's a picture that I want you to be sure and show of us taking a cruise to England because as a professor, he was allowed to have a sabbatical. And so when the sabbatical came, he said, we're going to a country where they speak English. None of us speak a foreign language. So we went to England, and there he took us back to the airfield where he'd flown from, Brighton. I was thrilled.
Mrs. Hunt, we have on camera now a picture aboard the New Amsterdam on board your cruise to England that you've just told us about. Can you tell us a little bit about who's in the picture?
Well, it's my husband George and myself and George Hunt Jr. because when George said he wanted a baby, when the baby did arrive, I said, because you wanted this baby so very much and you've come back from a very terrible war, I would really like to call him George Sylvester Hunt Jr. And so my husband agreed. And then there is Lynn Meredith Hunt, and there is Marilee Margaret Hunt. And we got this trip because my husband was a professor at the university, and you get a sabbatical every 7 years if you've done your job well and if you're tenured, which my husband was. And he decided to go to England to study ducks on the Stod Marsh. So we lived in County Kent for almost a year, and we traveled extensively. We went to Italy, where my father was born, and we saw my relatives down in Sicily, and we went to all around England, and we visited many public mansions and trusts, and we also saw a lot of birds and a lot of museums. And what I wanted to add to this conversation was living with George was really quite a happy thing because he didn't dwell on the past. He didn't make a lot of fuss about being a prisoner. He simply said, I will not dwell on that. I will work toward having a fine family, having a good relationship with my wife, and helping my students to have good jobs.
Mrs. Hunt, we're now looking at another picture apparently taken on board the cruise, and it appears there's a birthday cake there. Would you like to tell us about this occasion a little bit?
Well, it was Lynn's 15th or 16th birthday, and he was just delighted to be entertained by us at the table because the chef had made a special cake called a torte. And after we had each had a slice of it, the waiters asked us if we wanted to take it back to our room, and I'll never forget the joy they felt or exhibited when we said, no, we don't want to take it back to the room. We want you to have it. And they took it back to their place and ate the rest of the torte. I'm glad I can include this in our talk because George was very positive about proving that the past was gone and now we were living in a better future. And I also should add that he took us to many, many wildlife places here in the United States. Yosemite Park, Yellowstone National Park, where I argued with him about there's a great big patch of snow up on the mountain. And he said, that's a glacier. And I said, oh, it can't be. Well, it wasn't too far up for us to hike. And we hiked up to that glacier, and we were so warm by the time we got to the top that we stuck our feet in the very cold water to cool off. When we came back down, George said, now you'll not argue with me again about what is a big gathering of snow. And I said, no, I'll call it a glacier. I have many good memories of my time with George, and I'm pleased to tell you that my children have turned out well.
Mrs. Hunt, now that we've seen that your husband came back from the war and went to school, and that you raised a family and had a fine life together, let's go back a little further, because we haven't yet looked at life before the war, and I think our viewers would be interested in knowing a little bit about your life leading up to that time. We now have on camera a graduation picture of your husband George when he was a young man before going into the war. Let's use that to think a little bit about the time before you met. Can you tell us a little bit about your early life, where you were born and what it was like growing up where you lived?
Well, I was born on Wayne Avenue in a one-room apartment, and my mother was only 17 and my father was about 27, and they had met because he was a railroad engineer on the B&O Railroad, and Mother used to sit on her front porch and smile at him and wave her hand at him when he'd blow the train whistle at her. And after a few times of doing that, or maybe several months or a year, he invited her out, but he never could take her out without my grandmother going with them. Eventually they married, and I was the first of 5 children. I grew up in a very moderate income family. The reason for that is Dad would buy clothes and shoes for us in nearly new shops, which I now go to myself occasionally. And he would find some very fine things for us. But I had a teacher who was instrumental in coming to our home to talk to my mother and Dad, and she said, this girl should go to college. And my parents said, we don't have that kind of money. And she said, I'll tell you to get her birth certificate out and dress her up a little more, less like a little girl, and send her out to find a job. I visited with Mrs. Totten, my Latin teacher, and when I got married to George, she asked my mother if she could come to my house and dress me for the wedding. I was really surprised at her attentiveness, but she knew that I had gone to college, that I had graduated, and she'd been a resource for me, because when I played the piano in recitals, and I did play often because I studied piano and voice and all the other things, I had about 60 hours of music in college.
Where did you go to school, Mrs. Hunt?
I went to Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. And I went there because I had accompanied people in competitions at that college, in their rehearsal halls, in their concert halls. And I said to my parents, it's a really pleasant place. Well, it was also very small. But I was told by my father, do not date or I'll pull you out of college. Well, that was a terrible threat, and I minded him. And I've never forgotten that the first boy who smiled at me at a mixer when I was a college freshman, when he came up to me and said, can I walk you home tonight? I smiled back and said, no, thank you. I'm not allowed to date. And by golly, the word must have passed around, because not until I was a senior did people I remember like Paul and Bob and George ask me 21, and I said, I can date. And so that's partly how I went out with George the first time. I said, Dad, I'm 21. I'm an adult. I'm going out with George, but I'm also going to go out with this man and this man because I haven't done a proper kind of dating time. I really don't know what a proper dating time is, but what I did was go out and enjoy different situations and learn about what I thought I might like. But when George asked me out, I was pleased because I felt comfortable with him. And he always had new things to do with me on a date. We'd sometimes just take a walk, or we'd go to a movie, or we would go ice skating, or we would go to a park and sample things, or we would go to a musical. Or I remember the first date, he took me to see Wuthering Heights and to eat at an Italian restaurant because he knew I liked Italian food. He really knew how to influence me. And so when he finally said, I wish you'd stop dating other people, I finally said, well, I think I'm going to stop. Well, he said, in that case, I'll give you a ring at Christmas time. And I said, that'll be fine. And so we were married just before he went off. And I quit my job teaching music in Dayton, Ohio. I went with him to Pio, Texas. And I was with him for about 5 months. But we deliberately did not have a child. And then he went off to war. And I fortunately called the supervisor of music back in the Dayton Public Schools. And he said, yes, Virginia, there's a music job. You can come back. So in October of 43, I went back to work. And I worked for 3 or 4 more years.
When George went into the service, you say that you went down to Pio, Texas. Was that where he did his basic training?
Further basic training.
Where did he start?
Oklahoma, I believe.
Ah.
Oh, and no, Dyersburg, Tennessee. Some in Dyersburg, Tennessee, and some in Oklahoma. And then he finally went out to another town called Monahans, Texas, and Pio, Texas. And that's where then when he went to Kansas to form a group, he wouldn't permit me to go with him. He was there only a week before they went out.
Oh.
I was very disappointed.
Was it just in Pio that you were able to be together, or had you been apart while he trained before he went to Pio? Or
No, I was with him for 5 months.
Okay, you
And then
were together at that time.
Then when he went to Kansas for a week before he was sent overseas, I did go with him.
Okay.
I got a job and went back to work. Thank God I got a job. And he sent me money, some money, and I banked that. And then out of my own paycheck, I banked money. And when he came home, we discovered that we'd saved, between the two of us, a lot of money. I can't remember for sure now how much, but he said that will allow us to go up to Ann Arbor and find a house, and I can go to school. And so when I talk about my grandchildren doing adventuresome things like going to Hollywood and to Europe to dance and to Colorado to teach natural resources, I'm amazed at their daring.
Mrs. Sun, let's go back a little bit because we aren't able to speak with George. Can you tell us a little bit about what you know of his early life, where he was born and where he grew up, and what some of his experiences were before he met you?
Well, he graduated from high school. He had a mother who was not well, but who was a wonderful cook. He had a father who was a piano tuner, who never earned a lot of money, and amazingly, they never owned their own home.
Where did they live?
In Dayton, Ohio.
Oh, in Dayton.
Mhm.
Okay.
And Irving, I never met Mary, the mother. She died before George and I met. But I met Irving, and he came to visit us often. And he tuned my pianos for me because he knew how to do that. I would say that George's and my background were similar in that they were not wealthy, but they were not extremely poor. George was really raised by his sister and brother-in-law because Mary died when George was 15 or 16. And so Irving and George moved in with the sister, and they paid money for board and room. George loved his sister very much, and he loved his dad, and he followed what his dad told him. I've never forgotten his daddy gave him a large sum of money and said, "You have a bank lockbox, don't you, George?" "Yes, I do." "Well, you put that money in your lockbox for me, but don't put it in the bank." And I said, "Why don't we let it make some money in the bank?" And George said, "I'm going to do what my father said for me to do." And sure enough, when Irving asked for that money back, he got it back the same way he'd given it to George. I found that I trust banks today, but Irving did not. That's a little bit of what you would see. And I have a book upstairs which will show you how careful my husband was. He wrote down for many years every cent we spent in our household, even for stamps. If I bought a lipstick, that 50 cents went down in the thing. And I'm reluctant to throw it away, but I've been thinking about it because it wouldn't do any good for the children to see how carefully he kept track of what we spent. George enjoyed.
Mrs. Hunt, we're now skipping forward again a little bit. We have on camera a picture of your husband duck hunting, at which you've indicated off camera was one of his favorite pursuits. Can you tell us a little bit about how much he enjoyed this and some of his time spent with his sons?
George liked the out of doors. As a Boy Scout, he had pursued some things within that group, and then as an adult, he learned to hunt deer, he learned to fish, and he learned to go with Pete Petoskey out into a swamp or a place where ducks would gather and shoot them. I cooked many a duck. I even cooked venison, and just one time I cooked bear. George didn't shoot the bear. Someone else did at camp. The bear was getting into the garbage cans and wouldn't leave the garbage cans alone, so the bear got shot. But George liked the out of doors, and on this particular day, in this scene which you're seeing, George was with his friend Pete Petoskey, and they were out watching for the ducks. The ducks never came, but when George got home, he said, "It was one of the best days of my life. The place was interesting and the day was good, and my friend and I chatted a lot. I liked it." He took his two sons deer hunting, and Lynn Hunt went with him most often, and Lynn got to meet his friends, his professor partners, and after George died, Lynn Hunt even went to camp a couple more times to shoot deer because of his dad. So what I'm pointing out is not only did my husband teach about the world around us, but he enjoyed going out into the countryside and looking for deer and ducks and enjoying the out of doors.
Well, Mrs. Hunt, I've really enjoyed talking with you today about the experiences of you and your husband. Would you like to make any concluding remarks for our viewers?
Well, there's something called closure on somebody's life, and perhaps as I think about what I've done and talk to you about today, it will be another form of closure on my relationship with my husband. Because when I'm here alone, and I never really feel alone, I'm comfortable with the idea that our 28 years together were very good ones, and I'm even more grateful for the fact that our children have turned out to be good citizens and to enjoy, and they've learned to enjoy some of the goodness of the world. But mostly, I'm pleased to have been able to talk about him because he was only a very small individual in this very large group of hundreds of thousands of soldiers who went to fight for our country. And I forgot to say, but I'll say it now, that quietly I worked behind the lines by giving out gas coupons and sugar coupons in the schools as a volunteer in order to save those resources so that our men could have food and guns and planes to shoot and fight and so on. I thank you for inviting me to give this interview.
Well, Mrs. Hunt, after your concluding remarks, I could not resist going back on camera to look at this wonderful photograph that you showed me. I think that it speaks of your family's love of aviation and of adventure, and it's a very interesting event, and it has one of the people that we've been hearing about in it. In fact, several of the people. Would you like to tell us a little bit about who's in this photograph?
I'll start with the two men that George Hunt Jr. wanted me to meet. Again, because I knew them 52 years ago, or now it's 59 years ago. But George Hunt would go to Oshkosh, and he and his wife and granddaughter, my granddaughter, Catherine, and Diana would work in the kitchen. And they would have a good time because they would meet famous people. And
this is the big fly-in of the experimental airplanes at Oshkosh, Wisconsin.
Good, that's right. Me, I thought, well, I'll go and I'll meet DeFries and I'll meet Smitty, but I didn't know that I would be meeting Frank Borman,
the astronaut.
Frank Borman, the astronaut. But George had us, and Diana and Catherine and myself, and Luther Smith from the B-17 and the pilot, Norman DeFries, stand in a line and get a photograph made with this very nice gentleman who was an astronaut, and ask him questions. And then George made sure we got a picture, and one Christmas he appeared and I unwrapped this picture, and I'm pleased with the picture, not only because of these two gentlemen who were with my husband on the B-17, but also because it shows that even George Jr. is aware that I like to meet interesting people also. And I got to go through a B-17. For $4, I could buy a passage through the B-17. For $400, you can contribute to Willow Run to rebuild the museum. And George Jr. had a gift from me to fly in the B-17. And Lynn Hunt had a half gift from me, which George paid the rest of. And then Carolyn Dawn Hunt has also flown in a B-17. And I really wanted them to be here today because of their dad, they got to ride in a B-17. And when I hear that noise of the B-17 outside, I don't have to go outside to know that that's that big plane giving $400 flights to people to help build the museum. But I'm grateful that you decided that this shows all the people and this smiling Frank Borman. It's a good picture, and it helps me to include George and Diana and Catherine in my talk.
Well, thank you again, Mrs. Hunt. It really has been a great pleasure talking with you, and with that, we will conclude our interview.
Okay, well,